Jason, welcome to the show, man. I am very excited about today's episode. Been excited to speak with you and just inspired by all the things that you work with people on. So thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I'm always excited to do a podcast, even though I've done so many. It's always great to have a new conversation and see what shows up and share something with the world, you know?
You have quite the amazing story with reference to addiction. I wondered, so that people can really understand where you're coming from personally, if you can talk a bit about that history of addiction.
Yeah, sure. It's so long and there's so many facets of it, you know, like that. As I've gone on, it seems to get it seems to get longer because I remember things, you know, and I've thought about areas of my story where there's kind of that I'd left out before, things that I've remembered that I'd forgotten when I was young. But I keep it brief, but try and kind of give a good understanding of the journey, you know, because my journey started in very young childhood when my father was killed, and I think that was like the world came crashing down in a moment, you know, when the police arrived at the door to deliver the news and stuff. And I was just 5 years old. And, I knew nothing of trauma. I knew nothing of grief. And probably until I was much older, because I just lived being me. And I think as a small child, we just roll with the punches. We don't know, but we're still adapting to the trauma. We're still adapting in our life circumstances. It still had a huge and cosmic effect on me, even though I didn't know it. So food was my first drug at, 5 or 6 years old. Much soon after that, I started to balloon in weight. I stole food. I would secretly eat food. And I had no idea why or anything like that at the time. Kicked out of schools at a very young age, classed as a problem child, taken to doctors and so on, and ended up in the psychiatric system by the time I was probably 9 years old, and was diagnosed with depression and medicated on antidepressants when I was 10 or soon after, around that time. And, I found drugs, heroin by the time I was 13. And ended up in my teenage years in prisons, institutions, psychiatric wards, sectioned and kind of diagnosed with a long list of, binge eating disorder, substance use disorder, personality disorders, different things. And in the meantime, my family life fell apart. I ended up in a homeless shelter. I had no friends. I wasn't allowed to my family home, because I would steal things, and I was not safe to be in there. I was pretty destructive, and disruptive for sure. But I knew no different, I knew nothing of anything then. I knew nothing of trauma, grief, even in those psychiatric experiences. I've got the reports now. I've got them in my drawer somewhere. A few years back, maybe 10 years ago, I kind of applied to get my old medical records, and it was really fascinating to read those psychiatric reports of me at 10 years old, because there's no mention of grief, there's no mention of loss or any of those things, and that's really fascinating. That was overlooked completely, and I was just seen as this depressed kid that they wanted to give antidepressants to. I was kicked out of schools and crazy things happened. And I was 23, I lived in a homeless shelter. I was a heroin addict. By this, I'd committed a lot of crimes for money over time, but by this point I was pretty broken and desperate. I lived in the same clothes day in, day out, slept in them. I was on a script for methadone, and I stole joints of beef from supermarkets to get a small bit of money to take drugs. It was desperate at the end. And that was by the time I was 23. And that's when I got clean. I went to rehab for the first time. I went to 12 steps. And I was told, you're an addict, you can't take drugs or drink ever again. And I was just like, okay, we innocently, because these people have got some sort of stature in society, we kind of just innocently take on what they say to us quite often. We're vulnerable, we want to start, we want to change, we're desperate, because the only reason I went to rehab was I was sick and tired. Sick and tired of my life, sick and tired of going to jail, sick and tired of being homeless, sick and tired of everyone hating me, just sick and tired of being me. So when I was told you're an addict, you can't drink or use ever again, I was like, okay, that's it. I'm an addict. I've been told by the doctor, it's kind of like, so it must be true because they know more than I do. Fully not understanding the concept, or that it's just an idea. It's just a learned, something that's learned by these people. And it's not a fact. I never got that. So I went to meetings and I committed myself for that for 22 years. I went to meetings. But what happened was, when I put down drugs and alcohol and I picked up food again, because the food had gone by the side when I got into drugs. So I gained, anyway, I was 350 pounds by the time I was 13 weeks clean. It's kind of like I'd just been shoveling food in my mouth, stealing food. And then I went on to do, over my years of recovery, what I call recovery, clean time, maybe you would call it, it's better than recovery. I had 6, 7 cosmetic surgeries because I had a war with my body, that I hated. I couldn't stop eating, but I also hated how fat I was, So a real war, cutting bits of my body off in surgeries, going to Eastern European countries because it was cheaper to get cosmetic surgery in a desperate attempt to find happiness and peace, I became a psychotherapist simply because I was unhappy and I wanted to know more about myself. And I thought if I could understand psychotherapy, then I would understand myself. So there was really this constant craving for knowing, seeking, the seeking of peace and happiness through learning. And one qualification was not enough. So I got 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, endless. And it was funny because by the end of all of them, I kind of thought, shit, I still feel the same. It's kind of, I still feel like, and what had happened was, by this time I was quite a long time in recovery. I got a lot of people asking me for help. A lot of people were therapists and counselors in drug treatment centers, and they all had secret addictions too, like me, so I thought, wow, who actually knows what happiness is? Because nobody seems to know what happiness is. We could talk about crazy stuff. We could talk about secret, shameful habits, pornography, gambling, sex, relationships, while we were clean. But yet these same people were sitting in meetings saying, my life's great. It's like, my life's wonderful. Now I found recovery. And I've always had this strong, what can I call it? It's like, I don't like that, and it doesn't sit right with me sitting there smiling, going, everything's wonderful to these people, trying to convince people that this is a great thing. Yet we're all secretly living in shame, and we're all kind of 300 pounds in weight, like 100 pounds overweight. We're all eating rubbish, it's kind of like, and can't control it. And so what's really going on there? That was my curiosity. What's really going on? And what is the source of happiness and peace and contentment? Because that's all everybody wants, right? Everyone wants to feel happy, at peace and content.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just went on this endless seeking adventure. I did the Landmark Forum. I did the Hoffman process. I trained in all these different modalities of therapy while staying clean, in recovery, going to meetings. So I honored the seeking in me. I just didn't know what I was seeking. I did not know what I was longing for. And eventually I came across a spiritual understanding that, like, by this point I was probably 22, 23 years clean in recovery, just going to meetings saying I'm an addict, and having resigned meaning like given up on hope that there was ever a chance of finding freedom, and that my life was going to be full of suffering with secret and shameful addictions and a on-off relationship to a 40-year eating disorder, and never being happy and content, or finding a relationship that actually felt meaningful to me, or never being able to be loved, being unlovable, all those, like, those core wounds that we have. I'm not okay. I'm not lovable. It's like things that we secretly believe about ourselves, or that show up in reflection to relationships, were haunting me. And I had this spiritual experience where, in a moment, everything changed. In a moment, and it was really bizarre because I see that my ego and my idea of myself, Jason as the character that had been my life, um, and all his qualifications and all his experience in addiction and all the years of going to meetings and understanding addiction showed up for this kind of spiritual, what was called an intensive, but it wasn't very intense. It was quite relaxed, you know. So this character showed up, but the character in me kind of relaxed to be able to hear something different, you know. And I heard something beyond who I thought I was, you know. I heard and felt and experienced a place of well-being within me that I'd never experienced before, a sense of calmness, a sense of peace. It was new to me. And I kind of, like, over this period, this couple of days, I was thinking, well, nothing in my life's changed. You know, I've not got more money. I haven't got a new relationship. I haven't lost weight. These were all the real problems of my life, you know. Haven't got more money. Not got a new job. How come I feel so good? You know, like, what's going on? How come I feel so calm? How come nothing matters? All these things that were so important and so difficult, so challenging and constantly on my mind seem to have just vanished, but nothing material has changed, you know. And I just had this realization that I was not this character. You know, I was not the character of my life. Those things had happened, but there was something in me that was far beyond that, you know, a more spiritual component to understanding that I'm not my idea of myself, you know. I have an idea of myself, but that's not who I am. I'm beyond that. And when someone said to me, you know, the truth is that you've been okay your whole life and you've just spent your whole life thinking you're not. You know, and I thought, shit, you know, if that's true, you know, it's kind of like how much I've spent my whole life thinking there's something wrong with me. And actually, I've got 100% track record of being okay. And I got here, you know, today. And that was the moment that I started to, everything that I'd done in psychotherapy and all the trainings kind of fell apart. You know, I thought, God, I can't do that anymore because people are not damaged and broken. They just don't have an understanding of who they are. You know, they've got a relationship with a character in their own mind that they think it's them. They're solely identified with their own thoughts about themselves. And then they go to doctors like I did as a young kid, you know, asking for help. They get pathologized, you know, they're having trauma response, activation of the nervous system, overthinking, psychological struggles, you know, and it's like, and the doctor's pathologizing these things and they're going away thinking they got a diagnosis. Which is the cause, you know, but it was only ever a description to start with. It was not a cause. It was just a description of a conceptual description, a categorization of behavior. So I had all these realizations over this space. It was over like 2 days. So I thought, God, I can't practice psychotherapy anymore. I don't want to go to meetings anymore because I'm not an addict. It's not true. You know, it's just a story I had about myself. And all the fear about relapse that had been installed into me over the years just disappeared. You know, I thought I can just not go to meetings. I'll be fine, you know?
Wow.
So yeah, that was the start of this part of my journey, which was about 7 or 8 years ago, you know, into creating the Infinite Recovery Project. I didn't know at that time how I would articulate what I'd seen because it felt very abstract and formless, you know, like a deep realization of something that couldn't be put into words so much. So I was uncertain as to how I could turn that into something because it seemed like this freedom that I'd found, I have to be able to point people to that. You know, it's like, because, you know, if anyone like me had a crazy, chaotic life of complete and utter self-destruction, you know, it's kind of like, and then could find complete freedom in a moment, has to be something valuable in that for people that are suffering and struggling. You know, if I could find a way to show people what I've seen, you know, it would be super valuable to the world.
And do you think it's possible to communicate that to someone?
That's been my learning process over the years, you know. Yes, I definitely can and have shared that with people that have had similar experiences. It's not like there's so much to it, you know. It's not so simple and straightforward. It's like I can create the environment for insight. You know, I can be present with somebody. I can help them relax from their own thinking mind and kind of question beyond that and look at all these things that I point to. sometimes I describe myself a bit like a tour guide, you know, it's like I'm pointing at something, and if you're not looking, you won't see it, you know, it's like, so, you know, it's a 200% relationship. You know, I show up 100%, they show up 100%, and they get to see something new about themselves, about life. Sometimes they don't show up at 100%, you know, it's just you know, it's just the journey for them, you know, and I'm okay. I don't believe I have to fix anybody. I think that's part of the process, you know, like people have to live their life and kind of and come to a place of realization for themselves. You know, I'm not saying anyone's broken or needs to change. I'm only offering the opportunity for that if people want it, you know?
Hmm. That's incredibly powerful. It's, I think one of the things that I contemplate, and maybe this is an unfair question because maybe it's a hard answer, but would love to hear what you have to say is who are we or what are we? You had this realization in those 2 days of I'm not this brokenness. I'm not this addict. I'm actually not the character who is my ego that I've built over the course of multiple decades. I'm
Mm.
something far beyond that. In your belief, in your view, what is that exactly?
Yeah. Um, you know, I could talk about in the book the absolute and the relative experience, you know, like the absolute truth of who we are is just pure awareness. You know, we are a physical body having a spiritual experience. You know, a human being
Mhm.
having a spiritual experience. So the absolute truth is, upon investigation, there's loads of books. I mean, if you follow the non-dual understanding, Rupert Spira is kind of like where my teachings in spirituality came from, and three principles originally before that. If you've kind of but I'm not affiliated with any of those things anymore. And I like to not to be connected to any particular community because I feel like all of them are forcing people into following something, you know, and understanding that is the truth, you know, and no understanding is the truth. They just all point to the truth. So upon investigation, upon self-investigation, there's a realization, if you're honest with yourself, that the only thing that you're experiencing is happening inside of you. It's nothing is happening outside of you. You know, you just project onto an outside world, everything, every struggle, every, like there's you know, the Viktor Frankl quote that says between stimulus and response, you know, it's kind of like he's talking about perception. So the only thing that we can experience is perception. We can't experience anything objective. We can only experience subjective. So, and everything subjective is experienced through our whole life of conditioning, of filters, you know, of ideas, of creation, that all is happening inside of us. And anyone who does that investigation can come to the honest realization there's nothing but pure awareness, you know, that everything's happening inside of me. That's the absolute truth.
Hmm.
And and then there's the relative experience of being human. So I'm in a body with a nervous system. So I'm a biological organism. You know, that's the truth. And my autonomic nervous system has been conditioned by life, by adversity, by tragedy, by loss, by abuse, by all these things. So the stimulus of this apparent objective world that exists outside of me triggers a response of the body. And that's where we go into the somatic, or what I call the relative, you know, that things will happen outside of me and my body will constrict, will contract, something will happen, you know, it'll open or close, it will respond, react, you know, with tightness, with tension, with a lump in the throat, with tight shoulders, the tension in the jaw, you know, it's like it's happening beyond the mind. It's not being created in the mind. It's happening in response to external stimulus. So that's kind of like how I see it, you know, the absolute and the relative, the absolute truth of spirituality, of who we are, and the relative experience of being a human.
So, and you have a podcast of your own, Jason, which is Misunderstandings of the Mind. What do you think are some of these common, and you've probably touched on them here, but these common psychological misconceptions about, just specifically about addiction? What are these common misconceptions in your view?
Well, I think like both problem and solution have been created by mankind's infinite creative potential. Like there's 500 or 600 talking therapies. That tells you something about the potential for creativity, and it also tells you that it's not the solution. There
Mm.
wouldn't be 500 or 600 if there were the solution. What one would have worked, or two or three or five even, or 10 maybe. It's like, what, 500 talking therapies. What I wrote about in my book was maybe we're looking in the wrong direction. There's an Einstein quote that says, any fool can make things more complicated. It takes a genius to make things more simple. What if we're not looking in the direction of creating more therapies, in helping to fix the self that we think we are, but just looking in a completely different direction and saying, well, that's not who we are. How about we look in a completely different way? Stop pathologizing, which is all of those models are pathologizing in some way, and look towards the health in people versus the illness in people. Look to what's right in people, because addiction is an intelligent, adaptive response to trauma. It is a normal human response to adversity. Like depression is a normal human response to suffering, to darkness. It's like all these things are intelligent responses, but nobody looks at them that way. All these traditional methods look at it as a pathology. They turn it into an illness or something that's wrong with people. And then we innocently, as normal human beings, go to these people that we believe have some sort of status or knowledge about something, and we get told what's wrong with us. And then we take that away into the world, and it further adds, it's like sticking another post-it note of failure onto ourselves when we go to a professional. The thing is as well, because these psychological solutions cannot bring peace and happiness and contentment for no good reason, because they're still rooted in this idea of a separate me and a separate you, and you're the professional and I'm the client, and I can't really do what you're suggesting. It's not possible. So it becomes another post-it note of failure, in these traditional solutions where people never fully find freedom. And so in a way, they're a bit of a plaster on a bullet hole solution, and temporary fixes. You might feel a little bit better with a label, thinking, oh God, yeah, I know what's wrong with me now. It's like, I'm like other people. It's not so bad. It's like, but they don't find the solution. They don't point you to peace and happiness, which is all that anyone wants,
It's one of the things I feel really passionately about is the pathologizing that's within current modern Western psychology, and then also the medical field, of this approach of the body and brain inherently will malfunction, right? And the very cause of that malfunction is the malfunction itself. It's kind of how I seem to see it is, you have anxiety, your problem is anxiety. You have depression, your problem is depression. You have an addiction, you have an a mind that is prone to addiction. And I think I think that's just a surface level symptom, as you're saying. We really need to get underneath. And I think you're going to probably the deepest root causes underneath our very identity as a human being, is what it sounds like, where we're taking that identity from. And it makes me think about IFS, and I don't know if you're familiar with IFS and parts work. I find it to be a sacred work, very, very powerful. And to me, you are, and you tell me what you think about this, but you're approaching what we would call the self, right? With a big S, you're getting in touch with that deep inner awareness that is the witness to all other parts of who someone is, and being able to heal from there. Would you say that's true, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I think IFS is great, and I'm familiar with it, and more lately, compassionate inquiry and somatic experiencing from Peter Levine and IFS are three approaches that have emerged, in the last, say, 5 years or more. I mean, I know IFS been around longer, but it's not been so famous as it is kind of at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Which do have. It's interesting because I think you could teach IFS to somebody who had no spiritual understanding, and they would just formulate it, and they wouldn't really be able to help people discover the self. If they hadn't discovered it for themselves, it's like you can turn IFS into a full concept. There's the 8 C's of self, there's parts, there's protectors, there's firefighters, there's managers, and so on. So someone could understand that without having a spiritual experience themselves. It's not that useful, but if somebody really understands the tool, how to use it, it's like, then for me, IFS is one of the most valuable kind of approaches and understandings to having a spiritual experience, of realizing that the self is like, the parts are not who you are. They're what you learned as a way of coping, and they're intelligent responses to the level of adversity that you experienced in early life in your developmental years. And they're not faults, like the pathologizing, which would fault them all as depression, anxiety. That what you said before, that's just what I call symptom management or behavioral management. It's like, it's nothing to do with healing.
Mm-hmm.
But IFS can, befriending and reintegrating, for want of better terms, the parts of self, the protectors, the managers, the exiles, and so on. It's the journey, is becoming more whole, becoming more integrated, of bringing all those parts together and making friends with them yourself. One of my famous things to say is, the hardest thing you'll ever do is meet yourself, and in IFS, that's kind of what we do. We meet those parts of ourselves that are vulnerable and shut down and kind of, in all sorts of different ways of escapism, right? And it's like, we make friends with those parts, and we have conversations with parts of ourselves that perhaps have been, that have been exiled, for want of a better word. Again, it's kind of like, for most of our life, we realize that anxiety that showed up, or that depression, is part of us. It's like, it's part of us longing for something that we've kind of just not been able to connect with. We just felt, I always say that the parts, they drive the bus anyway, like they're in control. So we can't just by force stop depression or stop anxiety, and only by befriending and knowing ourselves, can we build relationships and become reintegrated, into the spiritual truth of who we are, that beyond the self-created identity, that I think I am.
And it reminds me of, a very significant experience in my recovery journey, and just my advancement in understanding myself and healing, was really when I came to have this relationship with a couple of manager parts of who I am, and realized that these manager parts were very big and inflamed, and had really just become me in so many ways. Had these other parts that were playing these background roles, and one particular part that was deeply exiled, a nurturing part of who I am. And when I came in touch with that part of me, I had this experience of just a deep compassion and a grief. I was crying for like an hour straight, just uncontrolled, hysterically. And it was one of the most profound and spiritual and cathartic experiences I'd ever had. Really, this part of me unlocking. And I often think about, and it's a bit of a kind of deeper topic than I go with my clients sometimes, but just the nature of those parts of me. Are they actual, little intelligences that make up who I am? Are they like, what are they exactly? Because it's quite incredible when you watch sessions, or when I've done parts work meditation practices with people, and it's very intuitive for them to have these inner conversations with these parts. What do you believe that is? Bit of a deeper question, but what's the nature of these parts of the conscious experience?
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, isn't it, when you first do IFS, that parts of yourself will speak back to you. Like, you can ask a question and get a direct answer. And I think that's kind of like, you think at first, oh, that's a bit strange. It's like,
Yeah.
what is that? What is that that's speaking back to me? Is it? Because you can feel the difference between I think about something versus a direct response from a part, right? It has a sort of a felt sense of being a direct response from a part versus a thought.
Yeah,
So
it almost sounds like a bit schizophrenic or
yeah,
dissociative kind
yeah,
of thing, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Mhm.
yeah. And I guess I just see them as fragmented parts of the self, but parts of us that had to adapt to cope, to survive. And I don't know exactly physically or what somatically what exactly they are, it's like or anything like that. But I just do know that having I done parts work with people myself and my own, plenty of my own, that we can have this relationship with. I mean, even there was an app called IFS Guide that I used for a while, and you can even do these text message kind of conversations between you and a part, So you're asking a question to a part, and then you're responding yourself. You're typing on the keyboard, but you're coming from the place of the part, and then you start having this text message conversation with parts of yourself. And then you start thinking, but oh, this is bizarre. It's kind of like 'cause nobody's typing but me. But
Yes.
the thing about it is it feels sincere. It feels like a real relationship with a part of myself. Even this morning, um, my girlfriend left on a plane this morning and I had a beautiful weekend with her. And I felt insecure, and I kind of had a conversation with myself. I said, what's going on? It's kind of like, what's the insecurity really about? And I had this conversation with a part, of me that was very insecure. And,
Mhm.
and what came of it was that this part of me trusted her more than it trusted me,
Mm.
and I was
Yeah.
like, wow,
Mhm.
how did I get to that? It was like and it's so true, because um, she's so soft and gentle, and when she's present, it's like there's a part of me that can be very vulnerable, and as a man in the world, I've kind of learned to kind of hide away from that, and especially love felt unsafe for me for a long time because my dad was killed, so it seemed like I made this decision that love was unsafe somewhere.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm. That makes sense.
so it's very even this morning having that conversation on my walk with myself, it's very I can like navigate this backwards and forwards and understanding of myself and then I can share it with her, and be vulnerable and say this is what's going on for me, and it gets received and I get to know that part of myself a little more.
Yes, and I actually like that you say that as well. One of the things that I've been considering lately, which stems from reading the book "Daring Greatly" by Brene Brown, if you're familiar with her, um, she says that we true connection, true vulnerability with someone stems from loving them not in spite of their weaknesses, but because of them. And I remember when I read that, it was probably a decade ago, and it just confused me. It's like, what does that even mean? How would I love someone because of their weaknesses? And as I've done parts work, that started to open me up to some of that. And I love what you said about this internal conversation with this part, this little insecure part within you of building that relationship, building
Mm.
an understanding for that part. How do you see weakness in people? What's kind of your perception of that, and what are your thoughts of how we can actually connect on a deeper level with each other? And that plays right into recovery, right? Because this is a very important aspect of it.
Yeah. It's something I've learned along the way, of um having compassion for people's reaction. It's kind of like I don't use the term weakness, but
Mhm.
um, like
What term do you use? Reactions or like a?
reactions. Yeah, it's kind of like
Mhm.
I would see, I could feel. I'm very sensitive, so I have a sense of straight away if someone's triggered. It's triggers or reactions I would use, and quite often if someone's triggered, it's kind of like I'll have compassion for them. I'll kind of see. It depends if they're in my relationship circle or if it's just somebody I'm dealing with in a shop. If I'm being very human sometimes. I'm dealing with somebody I don't even know. I might just tell them to, whatever. It's kind of like, and not really think twice about it. But if there's somebody I'm in relationship with, are meaningful to me, or in my, friendship group or my girlfriend, I've learned to be curious, like what's really going on for them. It's kind of like, and to have compassion for that part. There's obviously some vulnerability, some sadness, or some fear going on, in this reaction. And not always, I don't always get it right, but a lot of the time I'm able to really step beyond that and um, connect with people in those moments. It's an opportunity for connection. If you see somebody, like see them, really see them beyond the reaction, like what's going on for you right now, instead of just jumping into the reaction, trigger, 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 like from each other. You say, what's really going on right now? Like, or what are you feeling right now? It's kind of like, then it's kind of like it can be an invitation to something very beautiful, connection. And I think that's, somebody told me that once 5-6 years ago, and I thought they were joking. I thought, no way you can do that. If somebody's off with you, you're just off with them. It's just natural, it's kind of like, but these days I feel like, I see people, the heart of them beyond the reactions. And it's very easy to sense something that's reactive versus, just present moment kind of from a soft place.
And that's those reactions, I think of, again, those protector parts, like you're talking about someone getting angry, for instance, that's that manager or that firefighter that's acted up inside of them. And then you're reacting with your protector, right? Your manager, your firefighter to polarize against them. And we can do this inside of ourselves as well. And what I've found in my own work internally, and then also in helping people with addiction, is you need to be able to get down to the roots of your deeper feelings, the anger or addiction cravings or perfectionism or these different protective strategies that we use, as they can be termed. These are this more the surface level kind of symptoms, and then what's deep inside, to my knowledge and my experience at this point, is kind of what you might call like the holy trinity of emotions, which is fear, shame, grief. I think that's kind of at the base of all of our protective strategies. Has that been your experience, or how do you view that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, like when it comes to addiction, it's really like I don't ask people to stop. I don't. That's not my job. I actually help people resource themselves and understand their spiritual nature, like and can reconnect to their body. To a point where they know themselves, and like addictive strategies drop away. They don't need it anymore because they become more content. Once they're more resourced, once they know themselves, they know who they are, they have a different relationship with their experience, then they just often say at some point, oh, I don't no longer needed that addictive strategy. So I'm not like tackling it in a traditional way from that. And yeah, I mean, quite often underneath everything are those fear, shame, and what was the two things?
Sadness,
Sadness,
grief,
grief for sure. I mean, like, those are the things that people are protecting themselves from, and I think like the spiritual component of that helps people to see that I'm having an experience, it's kind of like, it's not me. So then the knowing of yourself, the bit where I said like the journey of meeting yourself is the most difficult thing, becomes less difficult because you're kind of okay with understanding that when you realize this is not who I am. There's still a challenge in that vulnerability. There's still a challenge to the young parts of ourselves feel it's risky to be vulnerable. It's will somebody still love me? Will they leave me? Will my friends honor my parts the same way that I do? It still shows up a little bit, but the more we do it, the more we lean into that relationship with self, and then relationship with others as a reflection of our own relationship with self, then it just grows and grows along the way, and I think our relationships change as a result of that work with ourselves. The people we want to be with and the people we don't want to be with change, and our whole perspective of ourself and life, grows from that, from that understanding.
It's very true. It's the external world is a reflection of the internal
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
I've noticed as my relationships with the parts of who I am, as those change and those heal and become better, and I peel away layers, my external relationships, I even find myself running into and interacting with people far more loving and positive and uplifting than I did previously, which is so bizarre and amazing to me, just the way that works. It's like this is just seems to be happening naturally. It's you're kind of looking around like, am I on the Truman Show right now? Am I where how
Yeah.
how is this happening?
Yeah.
It's incredible. Um, I don't know if you had any other thoughts about that, but if you don't, I wanted to actually talk about somatic work. And there's a lot of, I think this is, I shouldn't say it's new because it's been done for a long time throughout the
Mm.
world, but new, I guess, in a modern Western sense within psychology. Um, can you talk about the somatic side, you say body mind or mind body,
Yeah.
when it comes to recovery and pursuing well being? Talk about this somatic end of things, why it's important.
Yeah. I don't know if you've done any of that in IFS, but certainly in my kind of IFS work, there's been a lot of somatic kind of component to it as well. But like, let's talk about why first, why it's important. It's like, I think the body mind is adept to escapism. It's really good at holding tension, and it had to. Like the autonomic nervous system is in constant activation for some people, or people have experienced a shock trauma, an event, or repeated event, rape, violence, and so on and stuff like
Mhm.
that. Or it's just been activated. They were never seen. They didn't have a parent present. Nobody was present when they needed somebody. So their body learned to cope with this kind of activation that was happening, you know. And some people will come in and I'll see, and they'll be sitting like this, I think we're just on audio, but like I'm just hunching my back, a little bit. And I look at them and I go, what happens if you relax your shoulders? What happens if you like let go of the tension in your jaw? We might do like a scan, starting at the head, feel your temples and feel your jaw here at the back, where we hold it, and then let your shoulders go, feel yourself supported in the chair, like a combination of IFS and somatic experiencing. Body scan, and it's kind of like, and you might say, well, where's your energy directed towards? And they'll say, oh, my throat feels tight. I feel like a lump in my throat. So learning that, one, we've cut off from the body, it's kind of, we've just become like a walking head, for most people that are suffering, they're in their head. I say, how do you feel? They say angry. And I say, well, how do you know? Like, where do you feel anger? And they go, I don't know. It's just a thought in my head, I have no idea of anything below the neck. So
Mhm.
reconnecting people to the body and having them release some of that tension that they feel that they're holding, somewhere. Sometimes people will just relax their jaw and burst out crying, and just go like, wow, how much they held in their jaw or their shoulders. They wasn't even aware of it, till I asked them. I remember a therapist saying to me, I was sitting there and I was doing something with my hands, and she said to me, what's going on with your hands right now? And I just automatically stopped and tears just started streaming down my face. And I was like, shit, I didn't realize how good the body is at escaping emotion, at escaping feelings, and how much I'm held, and then now, like when I see people come into my practice with skin conditions, with chronic fatigue, with fibromyalgia, with bad backs, bad necks, eczema, all sorts of different things, it's kind of like 99% of it is caused from caused from that internal suffering and autonomic nervous system activation, and their body's kind of attempt to offset that internal dis-ease, not disease, but dis-ease, like that sense of dis-ease. So that's why it's important, like to coming back into the body, and then moving forward, becoming grounded and having a relationship with our own body, like knowing that we have a tendency to contract, to constrict, to hold, to be tense. It's kind of like that relationship with self that we talked about, from IFS. It's part of that relationship with self. Like the body is part of it because as I said, most people have been a living head. They don't realize why they do what they do. They don't even know about the autonomic nervous system, contraction, constriction, tension, and so on, and the body being part of it. In fact, if you read Stephen Porges' neuroception theory, which neuroception is like perception of the mind, but it's neuroception means interpretation of the body. And he says that 80% of human experience is basically perceived through the body, through the nervous system. So bottom up versus top down. So starting to connect to the body and understand that I don't know if it's 80%, I don't know if that's measurable, but a large percentage of our experience is felt through the body. Don't just think about you meet somebody you haven't seen for a while. Your body is open. Oh God, it's so good to see you. Your body opens, right? Or it's like somebody you don't like, your body closes off. Let's get away from this person, quick, hide. It's like your body's closed. There's just a basic understanding of your body opening or closing, opening, contracting. It's kind of like, and he's doing this all the time to everyone and everything. So coming back to be grounded, it's called, embodied spirituality. It's like it's not just a mind-based understanding, but it's a grounded understanding in the body mind of ourselves, of all of our working experience. It seems half a story, or not even a half a story, just to know the mind, and not to understand the somatic part of experiencing.
Is in my Christian faith, in our scripture, there's a passage that says the body and the spirit are the soul of man. That essentially it's combining the two together and saying these both make up who you are as a soul, which I think is beautiful. And something that I've been practicing along with this, because I said I'm with somatic work and this embodiment practices and body awareness. This is something over the last year that I've really been trying to integrate into my own life. I've been practicing just being very present with my emotions. As you were saying, we're very adept at escaping and running from what we're feeling. And I've noticed as I've done this, and this goes right along with parts work and IFS, you'll notice, and I'll point out the parts, but when I experience a trigger, right, for whatever it might be, but in this case, specifically with, I had an experience where I was online and I have a history of pornography addiction. It's 10 plus years. I was online. I looked up, was building something in Canva, typed in a prompt and an image popped up that was instantly triggering for me. And I closed my eyes and I was very present with what I was feeling and experiencing. And I noticed a few different parts. One, I noticed the sexual arousal, which is very normal, very human. And then I noticed right along with that, there was fear, is what I felt. And the fear was, this is going to overtake me. This is going to, it's going to take control of me and make me do something that I don't want to do. There's the feeling of, I'm a bad person for feeling this, right? So the fear and the shame, that very sensitive kind of part of me, what would be the exile or that part that would take on that role. And then a part of me judging me, like, get your mind off of this. Why are you thinking about that? What's wrong with you? And then the other part, so that's manager, right? And then the other part would be the one saying, oh yeah, this is great. This is exciting. Let's engage with this, right? And that's, I think, that firefighter part that's just, let's dive in and just go crazy. But that was all experienced just by being very present and going internal into my body and into thought. And I didn't need to do anything about it. That's the amazing thing. It's just simply being present with it and aware of it. I've done this as well with, again, with my history. I still face daily kind of urges and things for masturbation, right? It's like deeply integrated into me from 13 years old. It was like my coping mechanism, my way of soothing. And I have been practicing just when those things come up, just going inward and even subverting my attention to that that part of my body, right? And just feeling it and saying, okay, there's an intensity there. There's a feeling of a desire, of um, a longing there. And it's all right for me to feel this. Um, Very powerful. I think often we've been taught we need to solve, right? Like if there's a negative thought that comes up, well, I'd replace it with a positive one, right? Just bring up a positive thought and redirect your focus. Do you see that as pretty destructive, pretty misguided when we're trying to replace all these, unwanted thoughts or negative thoughts or things like that? Or do you have any other thoughts about kind of what I've just described?
Yeah, there's a few things that came up. I, I think that's just taught in traditional psychology, like reframing and kind of replacing positive with negative. And obviously, it may give you temporary solution to some people, and perhaps it makes other people feel like a failure because they just can't do it. Um, and really, the only way forward is to get to know and befriend and make friends with those parts of ourselves. Like to understand what's going on here. What's really being felt. And I always have understood that you can't bully or force apart. It's kind of like you have to make friends with it. It's the only way it will trust you. And that's the journey towards healing. And I think if you can have those, I just want to add that if you can have those self-led conversations with parts, which I can in some cases, but I can't in others. Some others I need another person. And
Mhm.
particularly the very developmental early stuff, I just get dissociation happening, even sometimes in relationship. I can't have conversation with parts. They won't speak to me. And, I need a mirror. I need another person. So my coping mechanism for that is just to shut down and go on autopilot and become like a worker or something, just get into work or something like that until I get an opportunity with someone else where I can explore it. So it's not always possible. And there's not something wrong for anyone who's listening. There's not something wrong with you if you can't do that. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. And, if you can, it's great. It's like, and if you can't, it's okay too. Some of us just need a mirror in another person, to reflect something back to us or to be present with. And, yeah, it sounds beautiful if you can do that. If you can have that soft, gentle, curious energy towards, those parts of you that show up without the kind of learned criticism and shame and so on, that you've perhaps picked up before you've learned this understanding of IFS. It's a it's just all footsteps on the journey towards yourself.
Mhm. I love that. It's very powerful. Um, well, so talk a bit about perhaps anything that we haven't covered in this episode so far, what you think is important for people to understand when it comes to addiction recovery.
Yeah. You mentioned relationships earlier, and I think they're kind of an essential component of healing. And I think like of all the modalities and things that I've done, my relationship has been the biggest healing container that's been transformative, perhaps more in more depth than anything else. And I think quite often in early recovery we can certainly just switch addictions. It's like when I say early recovery, I mean traditional recovery. We kind of have a tendency to stop taking drugs and pick up something else. And quite often that thing that we pick up, particularly in 12 steps, it was a very common experience. That other thing that we pick up is usually food because it's the first readily available thing. And next it's relationships, because that's often readily available with two people with a longing in their heart for love, but who's not understanding it. And without that understanding of self at that time, those relationships can be what we call destructive to each other. Um, but as you go along, you start to understand the value, as you go in my project, an Infinite Recovery Project, we're kind of helping to see that a relationship is really just like a clean mirror. One that works for you is a clean mirror, somebody that sees you and parts of yourself that you can't see yourself, or creates an environment of vulnerability and safety, where we can really explore ourselves with another person in a container that feels safe, and where parts of us get seen and get validated and get heard. Perhaps that wouldn't even show up if we were alone, and perhaps sometimes wouldn't even show up with a therapist. It's kind of like depending on who we have therapy with. So there's so much beauty and so much healing potential in relationships, and there's a lot of stories about, you should never get into a relationship in early recovery, and so on and so on, but I don't subscribe to that. I say, whatever life sends your way, is whatever's meant to be next. And there's always a lesson in it, it's something to be learned about yourself. But, that's the beauty of connection, of connection in relationship with somebody, and even like I even say that when I say relationships can become destructive in early recovery, there's still something to learn about ourselves in those experiences. It's not that two people are bad, or one of them's bad and one of them's innocent, or one's a victim. It's like, which is typically the way it's understood. It's really to see that there's something to be learned. I pick somebody that will highlight the biggest wound in myself. And then I blame them for being that person that I knew they would be, at the start, or so on. It's kind of like, or the same as the last partner that I had. They didn't love me, or they didn't see me, or they didn't value me, or they treated me badly. We don't see that we pick that person on purpose. That is life's role, is to heal ourselves. Life will keep presenting us with opportunities to see ourselves more deeply. And that's what's happening in these relationships that we pick that are, I use the word destructive just as an explanation of challenging situations. That's it. I don't even like labels at all. But life will continue to give us these lessons, and I don't mean that you pick someone abusive on purpose to learn a lesson. It's kind of like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, we have these relationships with people who highlight a wound within ourselves. It's like, and then we get the opportunity to heal that part of ourselves if both people can see beyond their coping mechanisms. And quite often they can't in early recovery, and that's why it becomes now what we call destructive. But when we can, when two people are willing to step back and go, hold on a minute, yeah, I'm behaving like this, something's going on for me, then there's a safe space created where two people can reflect and contemplate their own experience, and then come together and share about it. And that is a beautiful healing opportunity, So I think that relationships are an essential component of our life. We're all going to have relationships with friends, romantic relationships with family, and so on. And there's such a big opportunity there, when we really understand what's playing out.
It's fantastic. Yeah. Well, thank you, Jason. I appreciate you sharing those things, and just a beautiful conversation. I think that's going to help a lot of people. If people want to find out more about you, your book, the Infinite Recovery Project, where can they go?
InfiniteRecoveryProject.com is the website. It tells you more about everything there. The book will be released soon, in the next few weeks, hopefully. It's finished. So that's probably the best place to look, yeah.
Well, congrats on the book. That's a great deal of effort. It's a long process. Yeah. What's the name of the book?
Infinite Recovery Project.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I should know that, but
Yeah.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much, Jason. Real
Thank you.
privilege to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.